So Meghan McPeak, at what moment did you realize that the Super Bowl was over for the Kansas City Chiefs?
I think, Morgan, for me, it was halftime when, you look at the Chiefs, they're putting up field goals, and Tom Brady and the Bucs are putting up touchdowns. Like, it's that simple. At the end of the day, I unfortunately betted against the GOAT, and it backfired on me. He was playing chess while the Chiefs were playing checkers. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, you can't trade threes for sixes and sevens, man. It doesn't work. My math isn't that strong, but I know that much. Dave Zirin, at what point did you know it was over for the Kansas City Chiefs?
I think it was the minute when the refs pulled out the yellow flag and saw it had a little picture of Tom Brady in the upper left corner. No, honestly, it was in the first half when Mahomes was trying to take Kansas City 99 yards for a touchdown. If you remember that, he's running for his life on third down, makes a miraculous throw to Kelsey, and Travis Kelsey drops the ball. Momentum killer. After that, it became clear that Shaq Barrett and JPP would be living inside Mahomes' jersey. And that was really the question mark before the game. KC was missing 60% of its offensive line. Todd Bowles, the defensive coordinator of the Buccaneers, he was my game's MVP, and he crushed that offense like it was a piece of paper in his hand.
Did he ever? And now the moment for me, from a football standpoint, was when Tyrann Mathieu made that interception that got called back because of that penalty. And as Tony Romo pointed out, when your defense commits a penalty, the offense suddenly becomes 30% more likely to score on any drive. And the fact that you have now gone from putting your offense back on the field to keeping their offense on the field, which keeps your defense on the field, which you pay compound interest on that fatigue later in the game, which you saw. And from a bad omen standpoint, I knew something was going to go wrong when I called my local pizza place and they were out of chicken wings on Super Bowl Sunday, which I knew.
That's blasphemy. Absolute blasphemy. How do you run out of chicken wings?
Well, in their defense, what I think happened was that a lot of people, they weren't at sports bars this year and they were having individual parties instead of big parties. So everyone's just, instead of cooking a lot and doing whatever, everyone's calling the local pizza place and ordering the same thing. So that was the moment I knew something was up. It's the second week of Black History Month, and we're doing Black History Month book recommendations. I hope everybody came prepared. Dave, you look ready to speak. Go ahead.
Always ready to speak about some books. For me, I wanted to recommend a book that absolutely changed my life when I was 12 years old. And this is the copy of the book that I read when I was 12 years old. This is Giant Steps, the autobiography of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Giant Steps, a reference to Kareem's love of John Coltrane. And I'm 12 years old. I didn't even know who John Coltrane was. So this book introduced me to Islam, to jazz, to what it would be like to date Pam Grier. All kinds of things a 12-year-old needs to know. And the coolest part, and by the way, you'll see my name here written in script, and it says 6F. That's because I was in Mr. Flanagan's class, 6th grade. But the coolest part was when I met Kareem a few years ago and got him to sign it. And this is what Kareem wrote. He wrote, "For Dave, enjoy what's left of this. All the best, Kareem," because it's in such terrible shape. So shows you Kareem's got that sly humor, even when he looks at you like he just wants to spit on your head. So I love this book, love Kareem, totally recommend this for people to read, whether it's February, March, April, or whatever.
Perfect. And I have never read that, but I recognize the title right away as a reference to John Coltrane. I too discovered John Coltrane at 12 years old because of Public Enemy, Don't Believe the Hype, when Chuck D said, "Writers treat me like Coltrane, insane." I had to figure out who Coltrane was. Man, appreciate that recommendation, Dave. Meghan McPeak, you ready?
I'm ready.
What are you reading?
I don't have the physical book because
That's fine.
I'm the type of person. So full disclosure, I have dyslexia. So holding the actual book for me is difficult when it comes to reading. So I'm an audiobook person. However, when it's a good book, I'll buy both so that I have the physical book as well too, because you got to support the paper industry because it is dying thanks to audiobooks. However, mine is by the good brother Bakari Sellers. And it's My Vanishing Country. It's, part memoir, part historical culture. He's from the South, so it takes place primarily where he's from. And it just gives you a historic lesson and cultural lesson on race in the South. And it's very eye-opening. I'm midway through it, so I'm still working on it. But so far, it is one of the, great books to read. I definitely think it's not just a Black history book. It is a January through December read.
Absolutely, as all of these are. And again, we do this for Black History Month because that's what's happening right now. But again, as you get to know us and you get to know me, you'll realize like I don't wait till February to talk about this stuff. Perfect. So for me, my choice this week, I'm picking an author, not just a book, because I happen to have 3 of his books here, but 2 of them are small enough to fit on the screen. And this is where all of this stuff also meets sports journalism. So this week, I'm recommending you guys get your hands on some Ralph Wiley, Why Black People Tend to Shout. Was his first book after leaving Sports Illustrated. It's a book of essays. It's part memoir, but a lot of essays and social criticism, and talks about a lot of the stuff that was happening, like making big news in the late 80s, whether it was Willie Horton. If you guys Google Willie Horton, not the baseball player Willie Horton, but the Willie Horton who wound up being weaponized against Michael Dukakis in the 1988 election, or Charles Stewart in Boston, who was a white man who shot his wife, killed his wife, shot himself, blamed the Black guy. Who did it? I don't know, a Black guy. And the Boston police tore Mission Hill to pieces looking for a Black guy. And it turned out Charles Stewart did it himself. And then when the heat came down on him, he jumped in the Charles River. I think his name was Charles Stewart. The last name was Stewart for sure. The thing about Ralph Wiley too is if you meet an African-American sports writer between let's say 38 and 48 years old, and ask them who inspired them, who got them into the business, who showed them that they could do this for a living, 90% of the time, the answer is Ralph Wiley. I remember, my parents bought me a subscription to Sports Illustrated. And I remember seeing the byline of a story about Grant Fuhrer, right? Another story that dealt with Black Canadian history, with a sidebar about Tommy Kane, and seeing his byline of stories about Fred McGriff, Tommy Hearns, Sugar Ray Robinson. And speaking of Hearns and Robinson, this to me is my favorite Ralph Wiley book, Serenity. It's a memoir about boxing. But it's not just about boxing. It's about all the things that boxing can teach you about life, but not in a sentimental manner. And this is what I like about it, right? Is that it goes deep into what it takes to be a great boxer, who is and who isn't cut out for boxing, and why it's actually okay not to be cut out for boxing, but also the steep physical and emotional cost that the sport can exact on people who do it for a living, even people who are successful at it. So if you guys get a chance, honestly, one of the best writers I have ever read, and someone I keep coming back to, Ralph Wiley. Black History Month, February, March, January, don't matter. Read Ralph Wiley when you get the chance. A week or so ago, the Canadian Olympic Committee, I think, feeling some pressure from human rights groups, and a lot of Olympic committees around the world are feeling some pressure or perceiving some pressure from human rights groups to boycott the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing, China, because of China's dismal human rights record and this dismal history, shameful history and shameful treatment of Uyghurs and of different Muslim communities and Mongolians. And so there is some pressure, real or perceived, for big countries, Western countries, to boycott the Olympics. But what the COC said last week, in interviews and in an op-ed in the Globe and Mail, was that it was not going to boycott, that boycotts don't work, and that the best thing to do to shine a light on the problem, the best thing to do to make Canada's stance known, is to go ahead and participate in these Olympic Games. And so when I heard it, when I read this statement, I was like, okay, cool. This Canadian Olympic Committee is going to the Olympic Games. I'd much rather a big announcement if you aren't going, because until you tell me you aren't going, I'm going to assume that you are going because you're the Canadian Olympic Committee. But Meghan McPeak, what do you make of this idea that big countries like Canada and the United States should boycott an Olympic Games in a place like China?
Well, I think Morgan and Dave, especially when you read that op-ed and everything surrounding that, I have to agree with the thought process of if we boycott, what are we really gaining? What is that doing? Because you have a platform of the Olympics. It's the world stage. The world is watching. So you can take that moment, much like we have seen this summer in sports with athletes taking the platform and taking the moment to use it as a megaphone. So you have, USA and Canada both saying, we don't plan on boycotting. We plan on attending these games because what has boycotting done in the past? And we've seen boycotts in previous Olympics. And, as we were preparing for this, you said yourself, like, I don't remember what they were boycotting. I remember the boycott or the protest, but what were they doing? What was the topic? So I feel that if a boycott were to happen, I think the reason and the cause may get lost in the noise of countries boycotting versus not boycotting and actually utilizing the platform, utilizing the moment to voice how you feel, voice your frustrations, voice your disagreements or displeasure with what is being done with regards to human rights. So I actually feel that this is a moment where athletes from both Canada and the US can actually utilize the platform to bring a bigger light and shine a bigger light and put this topic on the world stage at a time when everyone will be watching the Winter Olympics.
Yeah, well, everyone in the cold weather countries, it's not like the Summer Olympics, which is a true worldwide event, but every place where you know what a wind chill is, they'll all be watching. The problem with athletes using that platform, that megaphone, though, is, again, they have to navigate like this minefield of rules. Well, don't mention this because it violates a sponsorship. Don't mention that because it violates this rule. Don't wear this T-shirt because it's political. And it does complicate things. But Dave, we've seen this before, right? John Carlos and Tommy Smith and so many African-American athletes in 1968 came to the edge of boycotting that games, and they decided they could make a bigger impact if they went and if they won medals. How does this type of situation translate to the current one we're looking at?
Well, I mean, it doesn't, because Carlos Smith and the other African-American athletes and their allies, they were doing that in defiance of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. So that they weren't acting as a state body to say we may or may not go. And that's what makes all the difference. I mean, if this is coming from below, like if they're Canadian athletes who feel in their heart that they should not be there in China, that it would somehow implicitly be condoning human rights abuses, then I think those athletes certainly deserve our support. When it's a state function, like the Canadian Olympic Committee saying we're not going to go, I think we know from history that that tends to be performative activism, and the only people who are affected are the athletes themselves. Also, I think the Canadian Olympic Committee, they didn't put this in their op-ed or their statement, but let's face it, they're trying to avoid a bear trap themselves. I mean, Canada does billions of dollars of business in China. Should Canada be boycotted? I mean, there is no such thing as ethical consumption in our society or ethical business, and everybody's doing business with China. And so you run that risk of having that mirror turned on you. I mean, the United States boycotting the Olympics. Have people looked at what's been happening in the United States these last few years? I mean, the LA Olympics are due in 2028. I mean, the level of police violence and violation of the rights of homeless people in Los Angeles is an epic, untold story. And the Olympics are just going to exacerbate all those problems. Should the LA Olympics be boycotted? I mean, once you open that door to start doing a morality checklist from these different nations, especially nations that trade with one another and work with one another on a host of issues, I mean, I think the best we can say is that, look, it's the Olympics. You know, it's not going to change whether or not people are treated badly or not by the actions of these Olympic committees. And so there need to be other avenues with which to fight these human rights abuses, because boycotting the Olympics is just not going to do it.
Yeah, and the three things that stand out, as differences between now and the Olympic boycott era are, one, it's a much bigger business now than it was back then. And there are too many stakeholders with too much invested in these games taking place, people in the countries that might boycott, and then the games overall for people really to boycott. It's the same reason that these games are going to take place in 2021 in Tokyo, regardless of the state of the pandemic, because it's not different from football. It's not different from the NBA. Yeah, we know there's a pandemic. We know people might get sick. We know we might become a super spreader event, but you know what? There's too much money involved. we're going to go ahead and do this. Two, the world is just, as you mentioned out, so much more interconnected now. Like you take one piece out of the Jenga tower, the whole thing falls down. And again, there's so much more money at stake that we don't know if anyone really wants to take that risk. And three, let's say the Black American athletes boycotted 1968. You don't get that moment with John, Carlos, and Tommy Smith on the podium, and this is now an iconic moment in sports. So, and this is not from the athletes can bring the world together standpoint, because I'm not sure athletes do for everything sport can do. I'm not sure that athletes alone have the power to do that. But from a cynical marketing standpoint, like those moments are worth money. Those moments are worth intellectual capital. And even if those gestures, those moments, those protests aren't widespread popular at the time amongst the mainstream audience, if history winds up vindicating the protester, who owns those images, right? If history vindicates the protester, who owns those images, right? The very people who tried to crack down on the protesters in the first place. And now 50 years later, they can say, oh yeah, our event was the platform. Because the other thing that's happening, and it's back in the news this week, is that the NFL was the target of a class action lawsuit by thousands of former players who are experiencing some level of cognitive impairment based on the fact that they played in the NFL and banged heads for all these years, and coaches and trainers were telling them that it was okay to incur a concussion, that you'd be fine. And years later, you figure out you're not fine. So where does race figure into this? Because all these players come from across the racial spectrum, from a variety of ethnic groups, but brain injury, you would think, affects them all, right? Brain injury does not play favorites, you would think, except this is back in the news this week. It's been in the news off and on for the last couple months, and then ABC and ESPN resurfaced this past week that the doctors who are assessing these retired NFL players for signs of cognitive damage have a handbook that they've been handed by the league as part of the settlement. And the settlement says, you guys have to follow this practice called racial norming. So what race norming is essentially, it's a handicap that you put on a black person's scores that test cognitive ability. And so if a white person scores low on this test, you say, well, he must have had his brain damaged in the NFL, because otherwise he would have scored higher on the test. If a black person scores low on the test, you say, well, he wasn't going to score high anyway. You know why? Because he's black. Black people aren't as smart. Black people aren't as educated. And the effect of it is black players have a much harder time getting money from this settlement, or getting paid at all, or getting paid what they deserve from this settlement. So 15, 20 years from now, if Dave's friend, Michael Bennett, who's a really sharp guy, let's say 30 years from now, he starts having memory problems and says, this is due to the fact that I spent 10 years of my life getting whacked in the head every play. He can apply for a settlement, and the doctors will say, well, not the lawyers will say, well, Michael Bennett, yeah, we know you're an author, we know you're a radio host, we know your memory's faltering, but how do we know that's not just because you're black and your brain doesn't work properly? So now, Dave, how do we square this information with the idea that the NFL is selling that we can end racism and that Black Lives Matter, and as long as Jasmine Sullivan can perform with Eric Church, we're on the way to ending racism? How can we even begin to try to reconcile these ideas?
We got to stand on the largest soapbox we can find and point our fingers and say lies, lies, lies. I mean, it's not enough to accept the tokenistic performances before the Super Bowl. I mean, because I think what this case exposes is the NFL in the raw. The NFL, which is a combination of just ruthless business profiteering and racism. And to see them dredge up what sounds like a 19th century cranial inspection of what racism is. I mean, this is like some seriously old school racism. If you're going to to brain norming to understand what the effects of concussions can be. I mean, it's another exposure. I interviewed DeMaurice Smith, head of the NFL Players Association, about this lawsuit. And, usually the NFLPA stays out of what retired players and former players are doing. They're cut out of this. But, they're taking a very close look at this precisely because the players themselves are very upset about what they're seeing. And that's really the X factor in all of this, to me, is how much are players really willing to take? I mean, can't be hired as coaches, can't be hired as executives. I mean, at what point does it just become too much for the players themselves? I mean, we all know why we don't see more, say, player strikes in the NFL. The average career is just 3.5 years. The contracts aren't guaranteed, but you really can only push people so far. And I don't care how good Roger Goodell is at doing chest bumps and high fives on NFL draft day. At some point, he needs to be recognized as somebody who's on the opposite side of the line in the process of trying to have some form of racial equity in the National Football League.
Yeah, absolutely. And no sport chews up, spits out talent to the extent that the NFL does, as quickly as the NFL does, as voraciously as the NFL does. But, I say this all the time, there are still only so many people in the world who are good enough to play NFL football. And if you keep treating people like this, eventually you get to the point where you don't get the players you want, but you get the players that you have to settle for because everyone else is either hurt or they just don't want to take these risks. All right, guys, we have a few minutes left. We're running out of time, but there's always time for in or out. This is where we tee up a topic and take it down really quick with our fastest, hottest, spiciest takes. First up, the Australian Open is underway, and which is great news for anyone that's tired of seeing Tom Brady win. Like, you could move on to the next thing immediately. Like, they overlapped. Boom. So Serena Williams is already through to the second round. I don't remember the name of the person she beat, but she beat this person pretty quickly. But the thing about Serena Williams, like, the newsworthy thing is not that she won, because you kind of expect her, even at her age, to win in the first round. But she wore this black and pink one-legged bodysuit. One-legged as an homage to Florence Griffith Joyner, who still holds world records in the 100 and 200 meters. Dave Zirin, are you in or out on Serena Williams' homage to Flo-Jo?
Oh, I am all the way in so much. I don't even think I could find my way out again. Like, I'm in the at all. I mean, Flo-Jo was so ahead of her time. She would have thrived in the IG TikTok era of sports like nobody's business. Passed away at age 38. I mean, and really a forgotten figure relative to her accomplishments. And so to see any sort of Flo-Jo renaissance with all of her style and all of her athletic daring do, I am all in on that.
Yes, and I'm in on it as well for the same reason, Dave. Like, when she was running, there was not, like, athletes didn't have a ton of leeway in terms of what they were going to wear, like the kit, right? Although in the '88 Olympics, the U.S. team did debut like these head-to-toe aerodynamic bodysuits. I don't know if you remember that. And a couple of people wore them in the preliminary rounds, but in the finals, they're just in the standard issue outfit. But for Flo-Jo to run 10.49 seconds, which is unheard of before or since. And I think she ran 21.3, which makes her faster than Scotty the Scooter Miller in the 100 and the 200. Again, she was like more than a generation ahead of her time. And those one-legged, and when you go back and look at the bodysuits, it wasn't just that there was one leg on, one leg off. There was like lacy, frilly stuff around the waist. Like, she put a lot of thought into how she was going to look as she went out here and smashed these records. Meghan, McPeak, you in or out on the homage to Flo-Jo?
When it comes to Flo-Jo and Serena, I'm all the way in on everything, no matter what. I mean, you go back, like, you're talking about what she added to her kit and making it her own. But also, too, don't forget the nails. Like, her nails were always on point, always on point. And Serena did a great job of paying homage to her as well, too. And I think as well, too, it's also from a standpoint of Serena's health. We, go back a couple of years when she wore the cat suit, and, the tennis committee was like, you can't wear that. She's like, I'm wearing it for health reasons. If I don't wear it, I could die. Like, it was life or death. So now she's getting a chance to not only take care of her health, but also pay homage to Flo-Jo. I'm all for it. Like, Flo-Jo, as you said, ahead of her time from the athletic standpoint, but also from the fashion standpoint. She was athletic, but make it fashion.
Yes. Well, and also, as far as Serena's concerned, there does not have to be a health aspect for her dressing up to me. Wear what you want to wear. If you're fashion forward, man, do it. Like, you don't need to justify it. If you feel like playing in a prom dress and you're still going to beat people 6'1", 6'2", beat people 6'1", 6'2" in the prom dress. I don't care. Like, the people will get mad, not me. In about 4 weeks, the NBA wants to have an all-star game. They're moving forward with plans to have an all-star game in Atlanta. We already know what LeBron James and Giannis Antetokounmpo think. They're out. They're out. Meghan, McPeak, you in or out or on having this all-star game in Atlanta next month?
I'm in on the game happening. I'm out on it being in Atlanta, just because Atlanta is one of the many cities, especially in Georgia, that is like, you wouldn't have known that there's a pandemic happening if you've been to Atlanta. They're all the way open. So I'm out on it for the fact that there's a higher risk of health and safety issues. But I'm in on the fact that the game is happening. Obviously, we know why they want it to happen. I understand, and I completely and will always side with an athlete not wanting to partake. So if that's what LeBron or Giannis choose to do, I completely support them in doing so. I think a lot of people just want to have some sort of normalcy. We weren't going to have an all-star game, so I think the NBA trying to make it work is good for the fan base as well too. We know that the NBA is going to take all precautions and all measures in order to protect the athletes that go to it and make sure that there is restrictions around it. So I'm in on them trying to do it as safe as possible, but I'm out on the fact that it's in Atlanta.
Yeah, well, see, now I don't know if they're gonna. From what I've
heard, no fans are going.
I have a Raptors game versus Kevin Durant that tells me that there are plenty of holes in this airtight protocol, right?
That was rough.
That's what we don't need. Hey, LeBron can play. Oh, no, he can't. Yes, he can. Maybe we should. Oh, yeah, because he was in a car with a dude that tested positive. Okay, well, I thought this thing was supposed to be airtight. Dave Zirin, you in or out?
Oh, I'm out. I mean, this is not a typical season. It's starting in late December. I mean, the entire rhythm of the year is off, and that's fine. But I also keep thinking you take the normal sort of disinterest that a lot of players bring to the All-Star game and multiply it by what seems like a pretty uniform desire to not really be too into playing it in the first place. And I just don't know if it's a recipe for compelling television, and especially not having fans. I mean, I watch NBA all the time, and I can watch it and enjoy it and consume it even without fans in the stands. But the thought of an all-star game without the oohs and ahs of the fans, I mean, that might feel a little bit too much like a death march to me. I can't get with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm all the way on this idea because we're in a pandemic. NBA wants normal 72-game regular season starting in January is as normal as they're going to get, or starting in December is as normal as they're going to get, and just be happy with it. If you are really concerned about player health and safety, give them all the weekend off. Let them recover from this compressed schedule. Load management was a thing before the pandemic. It needs to be more of a thing now because everyone's under a lot more stress, and mental, emotional, physical stress can affect your health. So give them the weekend off, let them rest, and then attack the second half of the season with a lot more vigor than they would have had than if you had taken all the best players and forced them to do this extra trip and possibly expose them to the virus, getting them to this game that nobody wants to play. Last topic comes to us inadvertently from a friend of the program, Brandy Brown, who is not Canadian, but she grew up in Minnesota, went to college in northern Massachusetts, which basically makes her an honorary Canadian because she knows a lot about hockey, watches like the real CBC. And so she was tweeting a thread, an ode to Eldon Pokey Reddick, who was an NHL goaltender in the late 80s, early 90s, had a brother named Stan. I think Stan's nickname was Smokey Reddick. Stan also played goaltender. He played Dave's favorite sport, major junior hockey, but never quite made the NHL. The thing about Eldon Reddick, the thing that we remember most about Eldon Reddick was this glorious, luxurious jerry curl that he had. If you look at Brandy's thread, she points to it every single time. So what I want to know is, are you guys in or out on Eldon Pokey Reddick having the best Jerry curl in pro sports history? And if you're out on it, who had a better Jerry curl? Dave Zirin, go ahead.
Oh, I'm all out on that because there's only one right answer to this question. It's Eric Dickerson, Hall of Fame running back, National Football League, 1980s, primarily with the LA Rams. But it's beyond just his Jerry curl. I mean, I just read an advanced copy of Eric Dickerson's upcoming memoir, and he has a whole section about the benefits of activator to truly get that Jerry curl look. And, you know, I mean, who else could put out a memoir with a major publisher and say, I need a whole section about the Jerry. I mean, that just puts Eric Dickerson in unique, rare air to me.
Okay, and before we go to Meghan, like Eric Dickerson and my dad could have had a big debate about that. Like none of us in my family, none of us ever had a Jerry curl. We had an aunt with like a Jerry curl light, and my dad talked her out of it because my dad was like into chemistry and stuff. And he's like, look, the active ingredient in your activator is glycerin. That's the same thing that they put in Drano to dissolve the hair that's in your drain. So you're doing this to your hair every night or however often that you re-up this activator. And very shortly thereafter, my aunt got rid of her Jerry curl light. Meghan McPeak, you in or out on Eldon Pokey Reddick is the best Jerry curl in sports history? And if it's not him, who is it?
Okay, so I'm really mad that this did not time up with me pre-cutting all my hair off, because for this segment I would have done a Jerry curl with my own hair, because when I actually put work in, my curls can pop and make it look like I have a Jerry curl without having a Jerry curl. So honorary mention to myself pre-cutting my hair off, but I am out on this, and I toyed with going like decision maker, deal breaker between the two of you, but I'm gonna throw a completely different wrench into this and go with Walter Payton, Man of the Year.
See, the thing is, his Jerry
curl of the year.
No, but his Jerry curl
in the statue, in the trophy that they give, it's got the Jerry curl.
Absolutely. Because that's what Walter Payton remembered. But the thing about his Jerry curls was a little dry. Like he wasn't as committed to the curl as Dickerson, Deion Sanders, who would have like this wet, loose, greasy curl and still put on the helmet, still go out there and play, glycerin running in their eyes, and they're still functioning. But shout out to the sweetness. Go ahead.
The thing is, though, is that who still had their hair long term, because they didn't use the activator. To your point, they weren't putting the chemicals in it.
That is true.
Not Eric.
Well, listen, I'm all in on Pokey Reddick having the best sports Jerry curl of all time. Quickly, here's why. One, again, he's a Canadian guy, and he fits in perfectly. Bell, Mosby, Barfield. He could have been the fourth outfielder on the late 80s Blue Jays. Bell, Mosley, Barfield, Reddick. The thing about Pokey Reddick, and here's why he is number one on the sports Jerry curl list. Like all the other people you just mentioned played in cities where it's probably pretty easy to get activator. Like Eric Dickerson was in LA, where people were like, rappers in LA were wearing Jerry curls like into the mid 90s. Walter Payton was in Chicago. Lots of places to get activator out there. Like Pokey Reddick, he's playing in like Edmonton, playing in Winnipeg, Brandon, Manitoba, places like this. Like how hard is it to get some activator in those cities in the 80s? It was probably pretty difficult. So his Jerry curl was not just a triumph of hairstyling, but a triumph of ingenuity and problem solving, because he was able to stay activated in cities where that stuff probably was not very easy to find. So Eldon Pokey Reddick, if I had a trophy, I would give it to you. You have the best Jerry curl in the history of pro sports. And Brandy Brown, thanks for the idea. Everybody else who's stuck with us this long, thanks for sticking with us. It's been every week it gets a little bit more fun, and I hope you guys are enjoying it as much as Dave and Meghan and I are. Dave Zirin, real quick, tell the people where they can find you on social media.
Yeah, if you want to talk, I'm at Edge of Sports at Twitter. That's primarily where I talk to folks. And if you have any questions about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Giant Steps, one more shout out to the captain.
Perfect. And Meghan McPeak, if people start missing you between now and the next episode, where can they find you?
On Twitter, similar to Dave, that's where I will engage most. At Meghan McPeak, I spell it the correct way. I have an H in Meghan.
Yes, just like my sister. Perfect. And as for me, I'm at Morgan P. Campbell on Twitter and the gram. Sometimes I engage, sometimes I don't. I tweet most of the time on Sunday nights, 90 Day Fiance, but I do use the hashtag Bring It In, and so I'm glad all you guys brought it in with us this week. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop a like on the YouTube page, drop a comment on the YouTube page, drop a dislike on the YouTube page. We don't care. All engagements matter. Or tweet at any of us. Use the hashtag Bring It In. Until next week, this has been Bring It In with Morgan Campbell.